historically, the belief in God and in spiritual experience and the reports of spiritual experiences, personal spiritual experiences, have skewed more highly toward women. In other words, more women reported having spiritual experience and having belief in spirituality than men. This gap seems to be closing. More and more men are supposedly reporting experience and belief in spirituality. This may be true. It may be that cultural expectations and norms are shifting, so more men are comfortable with reporting this, because in the past, intuition was connected to women, and so men were less likely to report belief and report experiences because they feared that it would make them feminine, which may be a simplification of that, but generally that's what it is. So that has shifted, and I think that's wonderful, but I wonder something. So I've talked before about the cherry blossom experiment with mice, and how mice in a lab were exposed to an electric shock while also being exposed to the scent of cherry blossoms, and eventually learned that cherry blossoms represented danger, and so they would fear cherry blossoms. And then their offspring also carried the same fear of cherry blossoms, even though they weren't exposed to an electric shock when presented with cherry blossoms. So I think that's a really important experiment, and others have been done with that same intention, to show that genetic disposition can lead to fear in life, and that we carry the pains and sufferings and fears of our ancestors. And it helps us to forgive a lot of things, I think, and also to understand things about our tendencies as humans. And I think it's about more than genetics. I think it's about coherence and about energetic connection. But regardless, if this is true, if it's true that we carry the pain of our ancestors, then it's also true that we carry everything else as well, right? It's not just the pain. Pain just happens to be the most searing experience that we have in life. So that's what's used in an experiment. But also duller experiences can be carried too. And so if we look historically at the education of women, and the fact that for most of history, women weren't allowed to have an education. They were limited to housework kind of education, needlepoint and music and things that expanded creativity perhaps, but did not expand what our society believes is necessary in order to be successful. Men were allowed that, women were not. That's changed, of course. Not everywhere, but it's mostly changed, and I think it's continuing to change. I posit that the reason that we tend to have less of a connection to spirit may be because we get locked into those structures built by education. This isn't to say that there's anything wrong with education. Of course, education has value and helps us to expand and grow in its own way. But I wonder if we place too much importance on the strictures of education, and it creates almost a kind of wall of experience within us that limits our ability to connect to spirit. And so because women weren't exposed to that form of education, that the formal education that men were exposed to for so long, perhaps since we carry the genetic and energetic experiences of those that came before us, perhaps women are a little more open because we don't have as much of those strictures in place, and men do. And now there's this gap closing, right, where more men are reporting spiritual experience and are exposing themselves to spiritual experience. And perhaps that's because more women are being locked into that educational system that creates those strictures. And so it's not so much that men are catching up, but that women are slowing down. I hope not. I think that with this shift in spiritual experience, that will change, and more people will be exposed to spiritual experience, and the expansion of that experience will happen because of it. But right now, I wonder, most importantly, whether our educational system closes us down to the experience of the energetic. And again, it's not to say that the educational system is not important or necessary, but that it's limited. And it's not about teaching religion or teaching spirituality in schools, but it's about, I think, exposing our children to more of the unknown, the unseen, to being open to it, to allowing them to be curious about it, to encouraging their imaginary friends, encouraging their psychic intuitions so that it doesn't go away, so that the strictures of education don't limit the experience of the spiritual.